I'm very pleased to introduce today's event on Sylvia Wynter, The Making of Black Metamorphosis. We'll have an opportunity to delve into Wynter's contribution generally, and in particular, today to consider an as yet unpublished work, Black Metamorphosis, currently being assembled and edited for publication. This work promises to greatly expand our understanding of Wynter and is likely to ramify widely across a number of fields, in much the same way that Wynter's work has already entered and done much to reorganize Black studies and American studies, among other areas. Wynter, as most of you will know, is a novelist, dramatist, critic, and philosopher. She's professor emerita at Stanford, where she taught in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. The writing of Black Metamorphosis took place over a long expanse of time, but it dates from the period after Wynter moved to the US to teach, which was in 1974. We have the perfect set of scholars with us today to talk about this text. Anthony Bogues is professor of humanities at Brown University, where he is also a professor of Africana Studies and the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. He's the author of several volumes that span intellectual history, political theory, and African diaspora art, including Caliban's Freedom, the early political thought of C.L.R. James, Black Heretics and Black Prophets, Radical Political Intellectuals, and Empire of Liberty, Power, Freedom, and Desire. Part of the editorial collective for the journal Boundary 2, Bogues is also a curator working on two major art projects. Among other places, his writing can be found in the South African newspaper, The Mail and Guardian. Projects underway at the moment include one on Caribbean intellectual and cultural history and another on Black radical critique. So we'll hear from Tony, who is heading up the Black Metamorphosis project shortly, but we'll hear first from members of the working group that's been assembling the volume, which happens to be a 900-page volume manuscript, and we'll hear what it's been like to ready it for publication. After hearing from the Black Metamorphosis working group and then from Tony, I anticipate time for questions and answers. So please add questions to the chat or unmute yourselves at that point. Until then, I'll ask you to keep yourself muted. So briefly, our first set of speakers. Bedour Alagraa completed her PhD in Africana Studies in the spring of 2019 at Brown, where she was an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow. She is currently Assistant Professor of Political and Social Thought in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and currently working on a book titled The Interminable Catastrophe. Along with Anthony Bogues, she edits the Black Critique book series for Pluto Press. Kristen Maye is a fifth-year doctoral candidate in the Department of Africana Studies at Brown. Her dissertation thinks through the emergence of Black studies as an intellectual project, exposing the limits and contradictions of disciplinarity. Felicia Denaud is a fifth-year doctoral candidate in Africana Studies at Brown University, writing her dissertation titled At the Vanishing Point of the World, Blackness, Imperium, and the Unnameable War. Felicia co-facilitates the Carceral State Reading Group out of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, works in the field of prison education, and is also at work on a poetry collection titled Words in My Mouth. Bryant Brown is a second-year doctoral student in the Department of American Studies at Brown, where he studies Black avant-gardism and works in a range of areas, including Black queer poetics, Black abstraction, abject aesthetics, and cultural studies. And Bedour, Kristen, Felicia, and Bryant will actually start us off, each speaking for a few minutes about what it's been like to work with the Black Metamorphosis manuscript, and then we'll segue to Tony's part of today's presentation, and then have some questions. So I think, if I'm right, Bedour, are you going to start us off?
Yes, thanks, Jay. So I'll just dive right into it since there's a few of us and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions later on. So up until the point when I first physically saw the text, Black Metamorphosis, years ago. I didn't actually know that it existed. I didn't even know that Sylvia Wynter had written a monograph. And it wasn't until 2016 when I was taking a seminar with Professor Bogues, who was my dissertation advisor at Brown. One day after class, myself and another student were going to Professor Bogues' office to pick up a reading that he had wanted scanned for the following week. And on the table in his office, we saw that there were these papers kind of arranged, kind of like in stacks and in piles. And he was arranging them. And he asked us, do you know what this is? And I said, well, no. And he said, well, this is a Black Metamorphosis. And I said, well, what's Black Metamorphosis? And he said, well, it's Sylvia Wynter's book. And I said, Sylvia Wynter wrote a book? This is the first time, ever hearing of it. And I was really confused. And that's when Professor Bogues told us, well, she wrote a book, it just hasn't been published yet. And I think we're going to have to put together a team to work on publishing this book. And when he said, we're going to have to put together a team, I didn't think that he literally meant we would have to put together a team to work on, publishing the book. And I didn't realize that the team would be drawn and comprised mostly of students in our department and from elsewhere. And I thought to myself, he couldn't possibly think that students could edit and publish, a manuscript of this length and this magnitude and this importance for such an important thinker. And this is when I began to learn not only a lot about Sylvia Wynter as a thinker, but I also started to learn a lot about Professor Bogues' pedagogy as an educator, because for him, it was perfectly reasonable to expect that students who were already taking the time to really study and appreciate her ideas could also be capable of carrying out the work of editing the manuscript. And that in fact, that these two things were always kind of already co-equal processes, that you needed one in order to have the other. And in terms of when the actual editing of the manuscript began, the team had a meeting, I believe it was in late 2017, early 2018, it was probably 2018. And that's when we saw the complete manuscript for the first time and decided, okay, we're gonna start working on this manuscript. And at that point, I remember all of us at the table, we started immediately diving in and trying to make a plan. And we said, okay, we're gonna divide it up like this, we should divide it up like that. And I'll never forget, Professor Bogues actually stopped us and he said, the only job you have right now is to read it. And we said, okay, well, like what happens after we read it? And he said, don't worry about that, just read it. And so we each got a copy of the text and then we read it. And then once we had read it once, he told us, okay, good, now read it again. And so at this point, it was several months out from the initial meeting that we had. And so many months later, we sat down and had a second meeting to come up with like a kind of actual plan for how to address the manuscript. And the feeling was completely different. We had completely discarded the point of entry that we had to the text as something that was a task that needed to be completed, right? We'd been completely unburdened of that idea that we had a job to do. No, the first and most important job is the ideas and developing a relationship to the ideas. And so we were obviously really excited, overflowing with responses and reactions, ideas, things we struggled with, things we thought were difficult, things we learned. And this is, I believe, I can't speak on Professor Bogues' behalf, but I believe he knew something that we didn't know at the time, of course, that the most important thing about editing a text, if it's your own text, if it's someone else's, is developing a relationship to the text on its own terms outside of our job of editing it. That we had to develop an intimacy and a relationship to the text that was, of course, on the one hand, related to the job that we had to do, but also that what the text deserved was not to be viewed through a kind of nuts and bolts technical lens. Otherwise, the spirit of the text would escape us and we would miss the whole point of what the text was trying to accomplish, right? And so by forcing us to go back and resituate our point of entry as one just concerned with reading it and then reading it again, I think that kind of laid an important kind of ethical foundation for us as we started to move forward with actually editing the text. And it's not easy to look at a text this large and not see it simply as a puzzle that has to be solved. It's really hard to kind of unburden yourself of that way of thinking about it. And, you know, I think this kind of desire to kind of pump the brakes and pause, right? And be very, very careful about the process of reading, that first kind of like need to pump the brakes really transformed me as a thinker. It gave me a different understanding of also what it means to be a writer and to commit yourself to ideas over decades, right? Something like that had to be treated with the utmost care from the very beginning. And if that careful attitude wasn't established at the point of entry, you would lose the whole plot. And I think this is something that Professor Bogues knew, and something that was an important and valuable lesson that I learned right when we started on the project. And again, making sure that we spent most of our time at the beginning just reading the text, right, without having to do any actual work on it yet, I think managed to drive home this really important point that, you know, this text, it's important whether it's published or not, right? The fact that it will be published does not dictate the care that it requires when we approach it. The ideas deserve that careful attention, whether they go unread by the whole world or not, right? And I have a different relationship to my own writing now as a result. I don't see my own work as requiring or not requiring publication, right? I commit myself instead to making sure those ideas have the space they need. And I think approaching this text not as something that was a race to the finish line to get published, but as something that we should be reading and that we should be sitting with every single day, regardless, is something that really, I think, again, transformed me as a thinker. And so then I think what I'm going to do next is I'm going to kind of pluck out two kind of conceptual moves that she makes in the text that I think are important, that, again, transformed my own thinking and the way that I approach my own project, and I think will kind of emerge as important kind of pillars in this text. I don't want to say in her thought, because this text is so vast and kind of and large on its own. And the first one of those is indigenization. And so some of you might have, you know, kind of scanned the text or skimmed it at the Schomburg Center. Some of you haven't. But her understanding of indigenization, I think, will have profound implications for understanding Black Indigenous relationality. And I think her concept of indigenization, what it does, it addresses the manner in which Black people have kind of refused the negations imposed by slavery in the New World, and the transformations or metamorphoses of these expressions over time and into the post-emancipation period. And what I find most kind of instructive about this kind of conceptual move that she makes is, you know, when she writes that the process of Black cultural resistance and response to the Middle Passage and to what lay on what she calls the farther side, which was the alienated reality of a new world. And she says new not only in its geography, but also in its radically different experience. And she says it's this historical experience and response which I shall explore as a process of indigenization. And so for her, she continues, right, when she talks about indigenization, she describes the, quote, physical and geographic disruption implied by the Middle Passage, by the change of the continent, by the total conditioning power of the plantation, which made him the African, right? The first to experience a near total alienation. And she says it was the totality of this change, right, that occasioned a cultural response of such a magnitude, right? So the response was an equal break to that of the Middle Passage itself, which is something that, again, transformed my own thinking. And she says that this response was great enough to transform him into the indigenous inhabitant of his new land. And then she goes even further, right? And she draws on Jean Price Mars, and she argues that what makes Black people indigenous is that we become indigenized to our primary terrain of struggle, right? And that struggle, cultural in its expression, has indigenized Black people to the New World. And this is the first kind of metamorphosis that she explores in the text. But the way that she develops the argument is the way that she scaffolds the argument is it is so masterful, right? You are left with no other conclusion but the one she has led you to, because of the manner in which she builds the argument so carefully. And this is where the kind of first kind of major proclamation in the text happens, where she says that, this indigenization process is that by which Africans had made themselves, quote unquote, new natives in a new world, right? And so again, and because of this, the meaning of the word native, in her estimation, undergoes a kind of reconceptualization that isn't unlike her reconstitution of the term indigenous, right? And what's interesting is that she then uses this re-signification of the category native to then launch into her critique of Marxism, right? So it's via this conceptual move of the native that she launches into her critique of Marxism. And she says, and I think Felicia will talk about this a little more, that, quote, Marxists continually look at the unit in their analysis of capitalism rather than at the relations between the units, relations that constitute the system, right? And so there's a way that she moves between her kind of historical kind of corrective via indigenization into the critique of political economy that seems kind of second nature. And for someone like myself, it was, it's hard to make that leap intellectually, but she makes it in a way that's so lucid and so second nature, because for her, she doesn't presuppose the discreteness of these things in the first instance. And that's something that is so fundamental to reading the text. And so because of this, right, she then offers a new understanding of the word native, right, and classifies it as a labor relation between native labor and settler labor, right? So we now have an understanding of the cultural magnitude of the expressions in the process of indigenization, and we also have a material. We also have a material kind of lens through which to view it at the same time, right? Certainly not one following the other, but always kind of, again, coeval conceptually. And so I think, what does it mean to delink indigeneity from land specifically, right? And instead attach it to a process whereby people engage their primary terrain of struggle via culture. And secondly, attach it to a process of labor devaluation, right? Produced by colonization and the trade in African slaves. I think this will have massive implications for the way we think about indigeneity at the kind of intramural level. When we say things like Black and Indigenous solidarities, again, we presuppose the discreteness of these things in the first case. And I think Wynter's understanding of indigenization and the native, I think it unburdens us of this presupposition about their discreteness, right? And the question that follows is, what does Indigenous struggle with this understanding of indigeneity as an assemblage of the old meeting new in this kind of metamorphosis, right? What does Indigenous struggle look like in the contemporary moment with this understanding of indigeneity? And what does that mean for Indigenous struggles in the Americas? And I think that is a question that emerges from my own reading of the text that I think is going to have profound implications for the way we have certain discussions around decolonization, certainly. And then out of this, she makes a second move, right? Which is, I think, incredibly important, which is that of transplantation, right? And she tells us that this metamorphosis or this indigenization happens by way of transplantation, which again is constituted first during the Middle Passage and then during what she calls the second Middle Passage of the Great Migrations. And it takes the form of the aesthetic and cultural expressions. She writes, right, that the popular culture in the New World was again sprang out of the imperative of redressing this negation. And I will offer a quote now that I think stood out to me in the whole entire text, and it's in this first part on indigenization. And she says that, for though the slaves were listed as mules on the plantation, they sang work songs, humanizing labor and spirituals, humanizing travail. disrupted from the land of the South into cities in a second Middle Passage, the Middle Passage that all natives of the globe are undergoing today. They created jazz. And above all, they sang the blues, work songs, spirituals, blues, jazz, were the counter-poetics native and indigenous to the American continent, subterraneously subversive to its surface reality. Right. And so away from the language of African survivals and New World Africanities, African derived, all this verbiage, we have a new conceptual framework of transplantation, which she says everybody on the globe undergoes at one point. Right. So here she manages to do something impossible, right? Like speak to the specificity of the Americas, but also offer us a totality. And some people think that's a bad thing. I don't. I think it's a great thing to push for that kind of totality. And she manages to do it in a way that, again, also acknowledges the kind of aggregates. And then the last thing I'll say is that as I was working on the manuscript, I was doing a few other things. I was writing my dissertation, but I also spent 4 months working on archiving Sylvia Wynter's papers, which left kind of an immense impact on me. And that's something I can talk about if folks have questions about it later. But as I said, while I was working on my dissertation was an attempt at a kind of call and response between Clyde Woods and Sylvia Wynter, thinking through the concept of catastrophe. Both thinkers, I think, are singular in the way that they highlight how aesthetic mediations, specifically in societies kind of haunted by plantocratic relations, right, is the site of the metamorphoses that make us who we are as Black people. Both thinkers do this, I think, in a way that's just kind of like unmatched. But reading her understanding of the kind of aesthetic mediations of these new natives in the New World actually clarified my understanding of Clyde Woods. I realized that I didn't understand what Clyde Woods was saying until I'd read Black Metamorphosis, because I realized that so many had focused on the kind of aesthetic contours of his blues epistemology, right? But less had been done, at least on my own readings of, kind of takes on his work, less had been done to look at the episteme part of his work, which was equally important. And considering, right, how he was making interventions in a kind of general epistemic framework. And for me, I think Wynter's invocation of Senghor, that culture is, expression of the relationship between man and his natural environment. This is something that Wood's work illustrates so clearly. And Black Metamorphosis was very much the connective tissue that allowed me to hold all of these things in my head at the same time, right? So not only did her work give me something kind of new language, indigenization, new natives, etc., but the thinkers that I had taken for granted, right? I was given a new sightline to those same thinkers by reading Black Metamorphosis because of the manner in which she kind of doesn't take concepts for granted. And in turn, it taught me not to take those things for granted when I look to other thinkers who have impacted me greatly. So with that, I will stop and I will throw it to, I believe, Kristen. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Bedour, for that context. I think it's really rich and invites a lot of thinking. I will try to keep my remarks pretty brief so we can get to everyone. But just to echo some of the things Bedour left off on. So I got involved with the Wynter Project in the fall of 2017, which was at the start of my second year of grad school. And, I also have a kind of story. I remember I took Professor Bogues' seminar about the intellectual theories of kind of the Black radical tradition my first semester of my first year of grad school. And he kind of teased the existence of this project then to Felicia and I and some other students, like, Sylvia Wynter, has this unpublished 900-page volume that, you might get to work on if, you play your cards right. So I was already enticed by the existence, that kind of figural existence of this thing. And so being invited to look at it and read it in 2017 was huge. And I remember there were these 4 huge sections that he printed out and made copies of, and we went through it, as Bedour said. And then, I kind of want to emphasize also that this project has had kind of multiple lives and multiple moving parts, because in the winter of 2017, around November, Professor Bogues asked myself and another student, Connie McNair, who's not with us, to go to Texas to assess Wynter's archival holdings. So she had her papers and her materials in Texas with her, and I think Professor Bogues was kind of negotiating where they might end up. And so he was like, just go there and see what's there. And obviously that experience, that invitation was unimaginable because, you know, here I am entering grad school. Wynter was the first person I read, like on how we mistook the math for the territory, was the literal first essay I was assigned in grad school. And it instantly shattered all the concepts that I thought I was supposed to be working with as a critical scholar. She's like, liberalism, no, that's not gonna work. Humanism, that's not gonna work either. Like, let's push past these terms and reach towards new conceptual figurations that might be able to describe this existence that we share as a species. Um, and so that was major. Connie and I arrived in Texas and went to this offsite storage unit that she had, which contained boxes. And it ended up being north of 350 banker's boxes that contained her life in writing, her life in words, books, horse readers, manuscripts, taxes, you know, like intimate ephemera, all kinds of things that we were being entrusted to kind of report back on. And so that kind of echoes what Bedour was saying about the kind of pedagogical strategy of Professor Bogues to just kind of drop us into this context and have us make sense of it. I was also struck in that moment. We spent, I think, 7 days there the first time. And, you know, I was struck by what I know Wynter's kind of project to be, a project that is um, about thinking at the limits of like categories and their confining and constraining effects. And you know, here we are as students who are trying to kind of assess her papers in order to prepare them for, you know, archival preservation. And yet I'm thinking at the level of this contradiction that it feels to be archiving and categorizing these papers of this thinker whose whole project is about, you know, um, refusing categorical imposition, trying to think beyond the organizational conventions of Western categories. Um, so by virtue of imposing certain, you know, systems of categorizing, you know, in the act of archiving, you know, we are very much kind of imposing certain logics of order at the expense of others. And so that was a kind of, you know, to live that contradiction out and think about what does it actually mean to archive? What does it mean to archive a living figure's life? You know, I had done some archiving work in my like undergraduate experience, but these are all figures in the 19th century who have been long gone. And so to be attempting to kind of fix and stabilize a life that is still being lived also felt kind of disorienting at times. So yeah, and I want to talk more about the maybe the kind of intimate and the affective registers of being in proximity to Wynter as a person. Obviously, her name and work preceded my contact with her as a figure, and it ended up being quite quite beautiful to just hang out with this really sweet woman who kind of reminded me at times of my grandmother, but who also was readily able to kind of critique the like figural conventions of the West that we have been forced to inhabit. And it made me think a lot about what it means to be a critical scholar in you know your elderly years. Like how do you how do you preserve your, you know, your critical impulses? What are your relationships like at that stage? Who are you thinking with and talking to? And you know, it became clear that Wynter still has very strong relationships with students who are advancing her work and who are taking it into new directions and who are attempting to follow up on the lines of questioning and thought that her work makes available and thinks about. um, and for me, Wynter helped me. She's helped me helped set me on the course of thinking about my project, which is about Black studies, and thinking about Black studies as something that kind of far exceeds any metaphorical analogy to a discipline, even though in the university there is that imperative placed on Black studies to comport itself as a discipline, to bear the trappings of disciplinarity and methodology. And Wynter, her investment in Black studies is as something that, has the potentiality to rupture, to arrive us at what Bedour referenced earlier as the third event. And I find that it's really fascinating to read her life as an instance of the Black studies that I want to kind of like think about and theorize as an orientation to living in the world. I think Wynter's work and her corpus gives us a lot to think about in terms of how we might think ourselves out of the world. And I'm often thinking like perhaps Black studies will, perhaps we can think about Black studies as a way of thinking how we live in this world in the meantime until we get to that rupture. How do we live ourselves toward that rupture? And I think her life is this instance of pursuing the question across format. So I find it kind of on brand that we are in a comparative literature department, because in many ways, Wynter's life is a life of thinking across kind of domains of form. So she goes to King's College in London, gets a scholarship, and pursues Spanish literature. And there she has kind of narrated how she was very much interested in the imagery and the kind of figural conventions of Spanish literature, and how that imagery and how those systems of figuration kind of like reflect the kind of codes of being and the kind of conventions of that cultural order, how that cultural context kind of narrates who it is to itself. And she moves into kind of dramaturgy. She starts writing plays, and she becomes a dancer. And all the while she's kind of pursuing this line about like, who are we and how are we able to kind of make claims on our being? She becomes a fiction writer. She writes a play that she turns into the novel The Hills of Hebron, and she goes on to be writing with the BBC, political organizing and labor organizing, and then in '74 she comes to the U.S. And I listened to an interview with her where she said, after I got appointed to a university position at the University of the West Indies, I realized that this question of how we like consider who we are and how do we represent our being, I could no longer pursue in the form of fiction or in the form of plays. I was now very much wedded to this essay format. And in many ways, I mean, I think Wynter has really like dropped the mic on the essay form, right? Like, I don't think you see the essay utilized and put to such uses as what Wynter does. And in many ways, we've talked about this, the group of us, about what it will be like to have Wynter in the form of a monograph, because for so long I think her bag is really with the essay form, and so it's really exciting to think about seeing her in this kind of fuller long-term engagement with a work that's sustained over time. And finally, I'll say that I think Wynter, not only in the life of her kind of formal engagement with these questions of Black studies, but I think there's a part of me that was looking for a kind of like ethical guidance from Sylvia Wynter in encountering her. And I think it was about like, well, how do we navigate this thing called the Academy of Black Scholars? And Wynter has this very unconventional academic record where, for her, the idea and the writing was primary. And she kind of talks about having taken losses because of her commitment to kind of seeing the fullness of her ideas through. So she was often, she was passed over for tenure. She was, denied publication opportunities. I wonder, there's a picture from her archive of a letter from the Chronicle of Higher Education communicating that they did not, they were refusing to accept her draft of No Humans Involved, saying like, we get many successful submissions every year, but we just have to like turn this one away. So, you know, it was par for the course for her to constantly be experiencing this kind of like not like not non-success in some ways. She was not like exceeding at conventional academic, the benchmarks of conventional academic success. And we see her now in this moment getting her shine in the moment after her presence in the academy. But I think that really it was hard for her, like financially and monetarily, but it was also hard for her in terms of like spirit and her work. And I think for me, I'm really interested in that as a form of the kind of like commitment to a Black studies that's authorized by an imperative that is not just institutional, not just about publication and getting CV lines, but is about explaining the world and narrating existence such that we might name ourselves outside of this conundrum. So I'll stop there. Thanks, y'all. Felicia, are you next? Yeah.
Yes, I am. That was a great narrating ourselves. That was beautiful. Okay, my name's Felicia. First, I just want to say thank you to all of you who are attending another screen. I want to say thank you to the collective. I want to say thank you, Dr. Bogues and Jay. I wanted to take this opportunity to actually write a little bit about, after the collective met and we had conversations and recalling different things and some good laughter, I realized that I had to kind of I wanted to work through the ideas of the manuscript to also get at the feeling of it, what it means to me. And so my remarks are entitled A Ceremony in 5 Words: Value, Process, Time, Dance, Drum. And these are really impressions. I'm no authority on this manuscript. And so this is just going through my notes, what I see I've been working through. So when I first began Black Metamorphosis, I said, and I remember I was on the bus taking the R line for my Providence people, and I said, this is a critique of value, as told from the plot, plantation, grounds, as told by the gods we planted, that's Wynter's image and concept, as told by the underworlds of the West. But to call this a critique or even a theory of value is totally insufficient, because Wynter really releases value from capital's regime of calculation, pushes at the limit of Marxist categories. She really kisses them goodbye. But maybe we can talk about it in a powerful way, a way that is careful and it's careful. And she also asks us to think with the drum. So for Wynter, there is something about life itself, about the capacity to which she calls inherit and realize the generative powers of the earth through collective expression. That's her phrasing. And that supreme ethic, I love this, to generate life as earth generated ours. And this isn't reproductive, this is about proliferation of vitality, I think, in good whole lives. All of this is at stake in how we theorize value. And what is being exploited, she writes, is not labor time, but life itself. So rituals of exchange, beginning with the conversion of African captives to Negro piezas, institute a relation of relative devaluation, and Bedour touched on this. And the pieza is a unit of Negro-ness. And this is key because it's the incommensurability of exchange in exchange and use values between Europe and West Central Africa that installs a kind of founding violence. And exchange processes enshrine and rehearse this process, the structural devaluation. And so you get from Wynter then this account of Jim Crow that explains it kind of like a spatial regime that is meant to produce devalued labor power. And then at the same time, culture structures the relative value of labor power. This is something she insists on. And so then I bounce back to this question of, the question of life itself. What is being exploited is not labor time, but life itself. And so I think about the landscape of culture that she paints for us, the grounds where provisions and spirits were planted, the planting of spirits. That's also key to this metamorphosis. And that language is so intentional about soil, ritual, kind of agriculture. And these are also the grounds on which plantation time is both extended and upended. So she's accounting for all of that. And then I think about Wynter's discussion of the Rastafarian concept of I and I, a divine expression of oneness. Capitalism needs third persons. And here she's riffing off of Rosa. Markets and laborers to be forcefully integrated into the world capitalist economy. And it does this over and over again. So I think about how third persons, right? Capitalism needs third persons. I think about how the Rastafarian I and I, this conversation she gives us, implodes the quote grammatical person. So like first person, second person, third person. And how it can help us think about the irreducibility of a self, but also the impossibility of a single self, the I and I. So she has this just a wonderful discussion of Bob Marley, of Rastafarianism, and works through this I and I. On Mayalism, which is like an Afro-Indigenous practice, the self transcends its own limits and realizes itself as unbounded, realizes the social buy-in through the shared experience of participation in collective activity. In this transcendence, the realization of the social is the support system of self-actualization and vice versa. It is this that enables the experience of wholeness. As in the mystic experience, one loses the self to find the self, life itself. Okay, process. Wynter has said that she writes towards the ends of empire, and this manuscript bears the traces of that intention. The redaction, the annotation, the repetition, broken lines, missing chunks, writing and rewriting to provoke new conceptual arrivals, and the way an argument can hang on a word. That's what we get to see on this end. And this gradual feeling of opening as you actually travel through the manuscript itself. The sense of the argument finding itself. And the published book, I mean, I'm not published, so who am I to talk, but like the published book conceals or denies or does something to like the traces of its own thinking. Maybe that's the work of great editorial collectives, but the manuscript, it kind of loses the struggle. The manuscript is where all of that lives. And it's really remarkable to see Wynter, the trail of words she leaves for herself in order to think the argument out. The way she underlines, when she bolds, I mean, you could probably create like a redux with just what she puts in capital letters. And I imagine it's some interesting summary of the entire manuscript. But when she capitalizes, it's like the theory, and all of these different markings, that's her thinking out loud on the paper with other people. And so just having the opportunity to commune with this version, with the process of the argument and not just the argument itself, has been a real gift and an honor, and especially alongside the people in this collective, because I know they also view it that way. And that's made this the process it needs to be. And of course, there's like reconstituting footnotes and really getting into that. And I didn't think I could appreciate her. I always call it like a citational mutiny, like citation against the canon. It's just wild. It's like, where are you getting these things? Like, how are you putting these people together? And reconstructing the text via footnotes is like an X-ray. And so you can really see like the withinness of it and, or like the spinal cord almost. And so it's been a different experience. I hope I'm not going over my time here. All right, I'll go quickly here to finish up. In group discussions, I've mentioned my intrigue in the space between like when she actually wrote the manuscript and the time it will be published. I think about the epistemic scene that she was writing out of. So we have this Fanonian stretch of Marxism, we have world systems theory, which Bedour could speak much better to, African retentions, the Black cultural void stuff going on, Black power politics. So I wonder what our conversations will be like when we can think Black Marxism and Black metamorphosis as these conjoined expressions of a political or intellectual moment. How will racial capitalism be remade in the wake of, or not remade, but handled in the wake of Black metamorphosis? And how will our own understanding of her concepts, her analytics, change when we can kind of see a fuller lifespan? So I see the antecedents of man and autopoiesis. She goes from overvaluation to overrepresentation. So overvaluation is like one of the important concepts of Black metamorphosis. And then we know we get overrepresentation in the later work. And so what does that jump in and of itself indicate about the turns that she was taking or the antagonisms that she was working through? And I'm so happy Bedour touched on sort of indigenization and the native, and I'm still working through all of that. And I'm looking forward to how, as Black and Indigenous studies fortify one another, how the text will contribute to the undoing of the settler masters, so to speak. And so I just want to leave you with three quotes that for me are like pulses, arteries of the text. So, the drum is the mechanism that prepares a ceremonial person psychologically for spirit possession. I would like to speak of the drum as the enabling mechanism of consciousness reversal. So the drum as a technology of consciousness. The gods were because they were danced. And finally, the aesthetic is the ethic. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Felicia. That was lovely. That was lovely. That was really wonderful. And I am really excited to speak after you and think through some of your ideas as well. But in order to begin, yes, I guess I just wanted to begin by expressing my sincerest gratitude to these incredible scholars, especially Felicia and Professor Bogues. They both brought me into this project in the fall of 2019, which marked the start of the year-long process to transcribe the typewritten manuscript and generate a searchable Word document from the manuscript. And so my engagement with Black Metamorphosis, unlike everyone else's, therefore began through what we might think of as the slow process of tracing Wynter's words. And so, yes, I think that was a different engagement. I still don't have a physical copy, which I'm jealous of everyone else, but I will get one soon. But in any case, this has necessarily shaped my relationship to the text differently. And my eye has been attuned to the more literary aspects of Wynter's work, to her stylistic and formal decisions. And I've spent a great deal of time thinking about how best to translate and reproduce the texture of her writing from one medium into another. And it's felt like a very purposeful engagement, and it has grounded me in a meaningful way over a year that was certainly ungrounded and uncertain. And so I'm grateful for that. And for me, again, the text has shaped my understanding of what a sustained intellectual pursuit can look like and what it can feel like on a page. So in other words, I am moved by the degree of sheer variation in Wynter's writing style. And I think we can put pressure on that notion, but for now, just the variation in her writing style, as Felicia sort of already alluded to, and which I want to like pick up on, I think her writing techniques, plural, really manifest as an extension of her interdisciplinarity, as Kristen already sort of gestured towards in this regard. So she will use space to her advantage. And specifically, she makes such creative use with line breaks, hanging one or two sentence paragraphs in emphatic suspension to really emphasize certain arguments or introduce certain texts. And she'll use 4 or 5 of these really short paragraphs in succession, only to follow this up with a dense and uninterrupted 2-page long paragraph of a single scene from Richard Wright's Black Boy, right? And it feels remarkable. It looks remarkable, and it feels remarkable to move alongside of that. And it's just, again, remarkable with how she plays with speed and works on multiple registers simultaneously in her writing. So not only has this forced me to reflect on how she constructs arguments syntactically, I've also spent a lot of time thinking about how to emphasize her emphasis, right? So for instance, and I think Felicia already like alluded to this, but she will often use all capital letters to underscore a string of particularly illustrative arguments, which gives me editorial pause, right? As to whether this should be underlined text, or should this be bolded text, or should you just directly transcribe the capital letters themselves? And I'm sure we'll continue to think about those moments as a collective, but thinking about these questions in isolation over the past year has been particularly difficult for me. And I'm likely overthinking a lot of these questions, but I do confidently believe that Wynter's writing style in this manuscript, throughout the manuscript, and specifically in the manuscript form, again, as Felicia already brilliantly gestured towards, is wonderfully deliberate. Her writing style is wonderfully deliberate. And finally, I wanted to pick up on a thread that other folks have already sort of laid the groundwork for. I think Wynter dares to name and to give language to dynamics, to structural positions, to cultural concepts that in her analysis were up until then under-theorized. I think this ability derives from, among many things, her extensive knowledge of Romance languages. She consistently thinks across language, weaving 18th century Spanish terms into her analysis of 20th century American culture. I think Felicia already gestured towards the pieza, which I hope we can talk about more. But I think what's interesting is that it's always an application of language in the service of understanding language's foundations. It's an application of language in order to understand Western civilization itself, language to illustrate, to give form, to offer schematics, or to reveal the schematics, right? To reveal the grammars. It's playful in that regard. And I've also been thinking about the mechanics, again, of how she constructs an argument, how she will use refrains specifically. I was actually thinking through this with one of my advisors, who I think might be on the call, but it recently came up again in a call I had with Professor Alagraa, as well as Professor Bogues, that Wynter's use of repetition creates these echoes that reverberate throughout the entire manuscript and throughout her work more broadly, which I hope Professor Bogues will pick up and speak towards as well. But she constantly repeats phrases, concepts, terms in what I would describe as a poetic way. So maybe this project for me has been an exercise in not only transcribing texture, but also sustaining an echo, right? Sustaining those refrains. And to this point about poetry, I think she will also often offer like a thorough analysis of political economy, but ultimately summarize her argument with poetry and with poetic language. One instance of this that I would like to share, well, no one else shared their screen, so I'll just read the quote. It is from this passage. Oh, okay, let me see here. I will go ahead and try to quickly share it. I just tried to get a screen capture. I wanted to pick a passage that had more texture, for lack of a better term, but I think this line in particular just really resonated with me, and I wanted to share it with you all. This comes from a moment in the text and when she's thinking about the United States, which is also very unique, I guess, in the scope of Sylvia Wynter's work, but she's defining and describing and talking about the United States as a pluralistic society, or a society in which members meet each other in the marketplace specifically, and that shapes everything else, and how pluralism sort of erases or hides the underlying anti-Blackness that structures it. And this particular passage, I think, speaks to her willingness to, again, step away from disciplinarity and really use language in her own service. So she says, in the highlighted part is what I'm thinking of, part of the problem that the white world, right, poses is this very insistence on seeing the problem upside down, as if cancerous cells were to accuse the tortured body of invading them. And I think there's something about Wynter's work and her writing style that seeks to turn the problem back around. And I'd love to elaborate on that with you all a little bit more, but I will conclude with an anecdote When Felicia and I were trying to come up with a plan to transcribe, we initially began by working with a librarian and a software program that allowed us to upload the document and in theory would spit out, a transcribed Word document. But the first time we tried to use it, the program, produced an almost incomprehensible jumble of words, as it was unable to accurately process the marginalia. And this is not a unique problem, but it got to the point where we would have, or rather I felt like we would have lost something through using and pursuing that form of reproduction, as opposed to just working through the document in this slow and meditative way. And though I spent the last 10 minutes talking about how interdisciplinary her work is, I do think, and I would argue that her thinking is undeniably disciplined, to the extent that it commands your attention, and it tells a story. And I think it gives us permission to dare, to inflict violence, to pose better questions, and to stretch language into otherwise unimaginable textures. And on that note, I'll go ahead and pass it over to either Jay or to introduce Professor Bogues, or to Professor Bogues. But thank you all so much. I can't wait for the Q&A.
All right, great. Thank you all. Thank you very, very much. First, thanks, Jay, but I just would like to thank all of you, Felicia, Professor Bedour Alagraa, Bryant, and Kristen, for really extraordinary reflections and comments on the process that we're all involved in. Really. What I will try and do now for the next 10 or next 15 minutes or so are two things really. One is to, I want to locate the text, and then I want to talk about the significance of the text. The text is, as everybody has said, is 900 words. What I think is 900 pages, but what I think is important is that the first part of the text is really a elaboration of a long essay called Junkanoo, which was done in a Jamaica Journal in 1968. And it then leads me to say, how was this text written? Sylvia in 1971 meets Vincent Harding, who has come to Jamaica to attend a literature conference. And she and he have a discussion, and Vincent Harding is a very important figure. And he is one of the organizers and founders of something called the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta. And the Institute of the Black World is was, in my view, the single most important Black radical think tank, if you want to use that phrase, in the United States. Everybody passed through it. Walter Rodney passed through it, C.L.R. James passed through it, George Beckford passed through it, Kamal Brathwaite, who used to teach at NYU, passed through it. Different folks passed through it from Africa and from the Caribbean and from the United States, all in an attempt to try and think about what does the Black world look like today, and that you're talking about in the 1970s. And Vincent comes to Jamaica, meets Sylvia, and in discussion, Sylvia proposes to him that she will write a book on minstrelsy and the centrality of minstrelsy to the African in America's life. That is, she would look at United States, she would look at the Caribbean, she would look at Mexico, and she would look at Brazil. So that's how the book actually begins in 1971, as an essay around minstrelsy. And in doing that, what she then begins to do is to draw from this 1968 article on Junkanoo, which is an article on dance, and which was a critique of the National Dance Company in Jamaica and the work of somebody called Professor Rex Nettleford. But in critiquing Rex Nettleford and critiquing the NDTC, you should realize, I think, two things. One, that Wynter is a dancer herself, that in her early days, what she wanted to be was to be like Josephine Baker. That was her, how she saw herself. When after studying in London, she actually went to Italy to live, and Austria. And in Italy, we have images of her doing dancing and essentially trying to live like Josephine Baker. But it doesn't quite work out, so she returns to London. But in the Junkanoo article, what is important is that it's for the first time that she raises the questions of indigenization. But she raises indigenization after a reading of Jean-Priest Mars's 1928 text, So Spoke Uncle. And that, I think what is important, therefore, in that first part of the manuscript of Black Metamorphosis is to see the thinkers that who she's working with. She's working with Amy Césaire. She's working with, very importantly, with Jean-Priest Mars. She's working with Fanon, and she's working with Senghor. And this is because I think in terms of indigenization, she is therefore also in contestation with another set of ideas, two sets of ideas that are dominant at the time. One is creolization, in which Camo Brathwaite is important for thinking about this. And the other one is a set of idea about African retentions. Herskovit's 1941 text, The Myth of the Negro Past. And so that what you are seeing, therefore, is this person in 1968 in independent Jamaica taking on these particular dominant set of ideas and trying to carve out and find a space in which she can describe both the history of the Caribbean, its present reality. I think there's also something important in what she's doing in this. She is actually trying to think about the subaltern, and she's trying to think about the practices of ordinary people and the way in which their practices are reproduced, and in which, in her words, their practices humanize this inhuman landscape. And I think, therefore, to begin to think about Wynter's Black Metamorphosis is to begin to see that as the entire volume, 900 pages, as really an extension of this particular idea, an extension of the idea about the humanization process of ordinary people in way in which they have had to face the travails, if you wish, of being in the West. And so for her, therefore, and this point has been beautifully made by all the speakers, it is about how the New World become natives. Now, what I think is also important in trying to think through this particular part of the text is that in doing that, she has to begin to think about Marxism. In other words, in thinking through the questions of culture and the humanization process, and this phrase in which she says the ways in which Black people populate this landscape with duppies and spirits and so on, that she has to think through Marxism. And this is really very important, because Wynter is an anti-colonial thinker who for much of our early period is a Marxist. And she's not an orthodox Marxist, but she accepts Marxism and the tenets of Marxism. Two things, I think, disturb her and begin to make her move away from it. Firstly, as she says in an interview with David Scott, what happens in Guyana. That what happens in Guyana and the ways in which the inter-ethnic rivalry between Indo and Afro-Guyanese makes her begin to think about the idea of the unity of the proletariat and the working class. And she begins to then think through the questions of culture and the differences that she sees exist in a class, amongst a class that is supposed to be united against the colonial folks. The second thing I think that makes her begin to pushes against Marxism is that she begins to rethink the idea of the so-called superstructure in Marx. And she begins to rethink that idea of the superstructure by paying great attention to culture. And I think this is what you are seeing in Wynter in the late 1960s and early 70s is actually a form of political cultural studies. That comes up later, much later in the British school through Stuart Hall's work. But in trying to grapple with this idea of the superstructure, Wynter essentially posits the idea of culture. And by positing the idea of culture, and she then in fact begins a trajectory that moves, in my view, from culture to epistemology, to consciousness, or to poeticism. In other words, you can actually map the ways in which when she begins to think about culture, how culture then becomes very important in our entire work, right up to the present moment. The second point I would want to make is that Wynter is the writing of Sylvia. Wynter does not write for tenure, does not write to be published. And this is one of the results why we have one result is the Black Metamorphosis, because she stops writing on Black Metamorphosis in 1977. He begins it in 1971 by drawing from the article on John Canoe. There are many versions of it, where I myself, I'm not sure of how many versions there are, but there are many. Yesterday, I was going through the boxes to see if I could see versions, and I counted 4 different versions. And then she really finally puts it to bed, if you want to call it, to use that phrase, in 1977. And in that period, she is dipping into it now and again, but she is writing it as a point of for clarification. In other words, the text has to be seen, I think, in terms of Sylvia intellectuals project, that it is her reckoning with Marxism. And that therefore, whether it is published or not, it doesn't really matter. But when she finishes with it, that last chapter, which is about Black culture, is that she has finished with Marxism. And the Caribbean, that actually by the time she comes to America in 74 and she's continuously writing it, it is then transformed into Black Metamorphosis. In other words, Black Metamorphosis does not begin in Jamaica, it begins once she comes to the United States. And that in the Institute of the Black World, there are 2 books that should have been published. One was Black Metamorphosis, and the other one was Vincent Hardin's There's a River. Vincent Hardin's There's a River was published, but the Black Metamorphosis was never published. And I think when I read the letters about between them, what is clear to me is that what you are looking at is that Sylvia is still writing. She's still unclear as to what it is that she wants to say. She wants to say in the final final analysis. The manuscript is at Schomburg because many of us don't know, but Howard Dobson was in fact the secretary of the Institute of the Black World. And so when the office is closed and he left there Atlanta and came to New York as the chief librarian at the Schomburg, he took the IBW papers, rightly so. He took them and Sylvia's manuscript was inside this. Let me just say, I want to say 2 more things and then just open it up for discussion. In the wrestling with Marx, Wynter does something which I think is absolutely remarkable. And it is in a simple sentence. She says, the secret of capitalism is not in the factory. It's actually on the plantation. And I think that if one thinks about that, then what one is thinking about is how she has reorganized the business of capitalism. not just around questions of life, but she's actually thinking about capitalism as unfree labor, which reorganizes the entire Marxist scaffolding about how does capitalism emerge through wage slavery, etc., and feudalism and all of that. And so the important thing is to understand is that in our wrestling with Marx is the profound point about the plantation, and the plantation as central and as the engine of capitalism itself. And the question I would want to ask ourselves, is what does that mean for thinking about racial capitalism? Because she's not just thinking about racial capitalism now through the questions of race. She is thinking about racial capitalism as a set of categories that is now reorganized, or capitalism that is reorganized and emerged through plantation life, through questions, through business of unfree labor, the relationship of unfree labor to free labor itself. And I think those questions, and therefore the questions of value and valuation, all the questions of black as lack and so on, all those are her phrases. But all of that is, and questions of exchange value and surplus. All of those questions are in the text, but they're in the text in relationship to this business of the plantation and what is the centrality of the plantation to world economy. My second point I would want to make is that Wynter publishes in 1977 a piece called Nihilism and Bob Marley, which some of it which is drawn from from Black Metamorphosis. But it is in my view that, in fact, you can put that text on Bob Marley, which CLR James writes her and says, this is the most magnificent text on that you have written. And that he says, please publish it. And I have a disagreement with you about it. And he states what his disagreement is. And we can't find the letter in which she responds. There's another letter years after which she writes him. But on that particular text, he calls it really the most magnificent text you have done. And in that text, what you see is her working through the questions of culture, but developing categories like counter-signification, counter-symbolic order, and so on. In other words, the entire analysis about Mali is around the Rastafarian movement and the music being a counter-symbolic force. And a counter-symbolic force, he says, which is a radical force for the now, not for the future. And so that, therefore, to me, when I actually think that text, the Mali text, is almost like a bookend to Black Metamorphosis, because she doesn't do more work on Black Metamorphosis after 77. And the Mali text is a text that she writes for a conference in somewhere in the Midwest. So I think that, and what is interesting is that the next major pieces she writes after 77 is the one in Boundary 2, which is Ceremony Must Be Found, which is a way in which she's beginning to think about questions of humanism. And so that, to me, therefore, it is really important to see Junkuno, 1968, Black Metamorphosis being written between 1971 and ends in 1977, and then bookended with this remarkable text that she has written on Bob Marley called From Nihilism, Nihilism and Mali to Democratic Socialism. Let me stop there.
Thank you all so very much. And I apologize for the Zoom bomb. That was my first Zoom bomb, so thank you for sharing it with me. As Frank Bruni says, it's been a teachable pandemic.
Yeah, it was a Haitian, but Creole, but that's fine.
Well, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that those were really an amazing set of meditations on Wynter's work and on Black Metamorphosis in particular. And I think that rather than say a lot myself. I'm going to just open it up because I think there probably are lots of responses and questions to everything that you've said. And I think I'll invite you. I'll invite participants to just unmute themselves and ask questions. But if you really want to put it in the chat, I'm happy to read your questions as well. At some point, it would be great also to hear from you, Tony, on sort of where things stand with the manuscript.
Yeah. Okay.
When we can expect to see it. I know that these things take a long time, and I think all of us are grateful for the work of the collective. But maybe we can just open it up, and I invite anybody who's on the call to pose any comments or questions.
I think Shemalore has a question or is raising their hand.
Yes, I am. I'm sorry, I didn't want to. I know there are a lot of people on the call, so I didn't want to overspeak of anyone. First of all, thank you for this amazing presentation. It's so wonderful to hear the way people are attending to Wynter's work, especially since I know it must be just an incredible project to kind of take on the vastness of it in particular. I wanted to ask how you attend to the cultural aspects of Wynter's work. And what I mean by that is that we've attended to kind of her Marxist positionings, her positionings towards capitalism. But I'm really interested, obviously, as someone who kind of is grounded in literature first, I'm really interested in what this work kind of says about Wynter's relationships with cultural production, with Wynter's relationships with aesthetics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, let me just have a shot of it. I mean, I think what one wants to say is that the wrestling with Marxism, and I mean, it is a deep discussion of political economy. Really, one of the deepest I know. Quite frankly, around different concepts of political economy, surplus value, exchange value, etc., etc. But then once she puts that to rest, the rest of the text is really about Black music, Black cultural forms. The text ends with Wynter really calling for Black culture or arguing that Black culture is in fact the space in which the new human will come out of. So for her, in between all of that, as I think as members of the collective have spoken. I mean, there's a Richard Wright. There's a there's Invisible Man. Invisible Man plays a lot. It plays out a lot in some of the things she says. Wright obviously plays a lot. Baldwin not so much in that work. But she is, and then there are also Caribbean novels. Lamin, a lot of Caribbean novels play out in that work. And one of the things, the note I made to myself when in thinking about this talk is that there is a preoccupation, and Felicia talked about this. There's a preoccupation around around language, and Wynter's trying to find new language for us. When Felicia said drum, my note I made to myself before this was that in fact she's thinking about the language of the drum, and if that she's thinking about that language of the drum, that's something that comes out, quite frankly, out of the Black Atlantic experience, to use that phrase, and to think about that language of the drum is actually to go back to Lamin's novel Season of the Adventure, in which he argues that the actual, here he's talking about Caribbean states. He says that an independence, that the first independence will fail, the second independence will fail, the third one will fail, and all else will fail, and this is how the novel ends, unless we speak the language of the drum. And so to me, in this particular text of Black Metamorphosis, once she makes that break and begins to dig deep into the poetics, a kind of counter, what she calls the counter poetics of culture, of Black culture, and then she's trying to find a language that is deeply attached to two things: religion, Black religious experiences, as also and to jazz, and oh well, not just jazz, and to different forms of Black music, and to dance. That's what she's trying to do. She's trying to find that language that in which we can then begin to think anew and think differently. And so you know, she, what is interesting if you think about aesthetics is that if you read a later piece she writes in a book called Exile, on Essays on Caribbean Cinema, which publishes about 1980, 81, and so on. There are two key pieces in that. One is Stuart Hall's thing on exile and cinema, Black British cinema. But in her piece on aesthetics, she actually has a critique of Kantian aesthetics. And in that critique of Kantian aesthetics, for her, the idea, what she wants to think about is, what is the work that these, if you're thinking about aesthetics, what work does the aesthetic do? And for her, when she says what work the aesthetics does, she's not thinking about function. She's talking about how does the aesthetics allow us to think through affect, but importantly, how does the aesthetics allow us to begin to think differently? And so that therefore for her, the aesthetics don't become things of works of beauty in a kind of Kantian form, a sublime beauty and so on, but actually becomes this, has a particular work, a particular label is the word I like to use, a particular label that opens up us different set of spaces for us to begin to think about differently through Black culture. So that's how, I mean, that's one, you know, that's what I would, in my response to you, that's what I would say. So the literary, all, you know, literary texts are quoted left, right, and center. But to me, what I think is important is her attention to jazz. I mean, to Leroy Jones's blues people is all over this text. You know, to all the writings around jazz and so on that she's trying around blues. She's trying to think about musical forms as this, as a kind of, as really the language of the drum that then allows us to think differently.
Thank you so much.
So there are some questions. I know there are some raised hands, but there's a question that came in through the chat, which I think is worth touching on. And it's a very big question. So if you could just sort of, so maybe just sort of tackling it in a small way would be sufficient. But from the perspective of Black Metamorphosis, what is, people are asking, what is the critique of Marx and the secret of capitalism, quote unquote, that can be found in the plantation and not in the factory? How would you distill the critique in that book?
Yeah, I mean, there are two things I would say very quickly. One is the critique that is a critique in which people think about the factory system as the ways, in the conventional way, as the factory system in the way in which surplus value, you know, and capitalism emerges. Capitalism, the conventional argument is capitalism emerges with wage labor, you know, surplus value, etc., etc. The plantation is not about wage labor. The plantation is about racial slavery. That's the very first thing. So you're talking about unfree labor. So that's a critique of capitalism itself, that capitalism doesn't necessarily depend upon free labor. And I would say to you that the recent histories that people have done in the last 2-3 years actually have been, particularly those who are trying to think about questions of a history of labor, have actually begun to think about what's the work, how does unfree labor function in capitalism, not just in slavery, but in other colonial places. So places in Indonesia, for example, and places where there are forms of servitude and unfree labor. And you know, the work particularly of some Dutch historians who are trying to think through that particular question, importantly, because of the centrality of the Dutch merchant system slave trade and to colonialism and early capitalism, from the late 1400s and early 1500s. So that's I think is the first thing. The second thing is that she is making the point, which I think is really important, that the actual slave, and she's drawing this from Elsa Govaya, who was her friend, and the first Caribbean professor of history, West Indian history, Caribbean history at University of the West Indies, but was also the first female professor at the University of the West Indies. Elsa Govaya has a set of articles around on British historiography of the Caribbean, in which she argues, and also another book on laws of the slave laws in the entire Anglophone Caribbean, in which she argues that the enslaved person is a property in person. What Wynter wants to do with that is to think about the questions of commodification. That particular phrase of Elsa, Professor Govaya, and think through the questions of commodification. Where does commodification begin? And this is why when one of our colleagues from the working group talk about the piazza, it is identifying a process of commodification, not that the worker becomes commodified, and that he or she then produces commodities, but the actual body, the slave body, is itself, him or herself, is itself a commodity. And in that process of commodity, of being commodified, when he or she then produces commodities for the world market, because that's what sugar was produced for. It was produced for the world market. When that happens, and therefore another commodity is produced, that what you have is actually double commodification. And then what some of us have argued is that in fact there's a triple commodification, because there's a way in which reproductive labor of the enslaved Black woman has to, it also reproduces and enslave, as she reproduces through rape particularly and so on, or the various breeding grounds that this masters used to have. She then is actually reproductive labor is of a commodity itself. So that there is all of this commodification going on inside the actual process of slavery itself. And one of the things that the manuscript does is to map at what point does the actual commodification begins. In other words, when is the African turned from a captive, i.e. just a captive picked up, and then becomes a particular commodity? And where does that precise moment of commodification begins? And our argument is that it actually begins when they begin to write in the accounts book what it is that people were. So somebody was like a hand of bananas, somebody was like this, somebody was like that. In other words, as they begin to name the piazza, then you begin to use the piazza system, you then begin to see the actual commodification system taking place in the actual factories on the west coast of Africa itself.
Thank you. And
I mean, that's a short answer to a very long set
Sure.
of.
Sure. Rod, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I did. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Professor Bogues, for all of that you're sharing. I wanted to ask a question, sort of in the direction of the John Canoe essay that Sylvia Wynter wrote. It's really curious to me how that sort of led to, this gigantic volume on Black Metamorphosis. If I think about the John Canoe Masquerade, especially in sort of plantation era Jamaica, that form itself was very disruptive, and disruptive in the ways in which it subverted and transgressed plantation dynamics. I think Robert Dirks talks about John Canoe as sort of the Black Saturnalia. And so I'm wanting to ask, can you speak more about how maybe Sylvia Wynter thinks about sort of the subvertive or transgressive potential of Black assembly, of Black people coming together? And so maybe not just on John Canoe, but as she traveled and maybe saw like different Black communities, how we think about Black assembly along with this project of resisting racial capitalism.
Yeah. Could I ask one of my colleagues to say something? They are colleagues.
Sure. Yes, we can open it up to everybody.
Bedour, were you gonna go?
I was going to say something short. Yeah. I think, what fascinated me the most about looking at the text is that the section on Junkanoo in the text has its own glossary, and it's the only part of the text that has its own glossary dedicated to it. So there is an appendix that we're developing with terms, and one of the questions we had was whether to collapse the glossary that she created for Junkanoo into the broader appendix or whether to keep it alone. And we decided to keep it right where it was in the middle of the text. And it's actually quite interesting. She writes this whole extensive meditation on Junkanoo, and then right before she moves to the next section, there's the glossary. There's no transition, there's no nothing. There's just the glossary on Junkanoo, because you can't pass go until you understand, right, the language that she uses to describe the way, right, that this process of humanization of the ordinary that Professor Bogues mentioned, you can't pass go until you understand the terms with which people themselves use to describe the manner in which they engage one another. And I think this also, so that's the first thing, is that this is like the actual text, the way it's written, privileges, right, the language of the Junkanoo in a particular way, right, that wouldn't say that the rest of the text is not the same or important, but it's there for a reason. And it sets us up for the remainder of the text. And actually, it sets us up for the way that she engages the kind of lexicon of blues and jazz later on, because she had just moved to America. So even that part of the text, there's something almost anthropological about it, right? Because she's jotting down what things are called, right, in America, and trying to, again, for herself, engage in the language of ordinary people as they do it. So for her, she has done it, and so now she is trying to engage with the terms that she encounters in the United States in a really interesting way as a result. But I think it's also related to this first question about her critique of Marxism and the question of culture. I don't necessarily think it's separate, because what's interesting is that she uses, instead of base superstructure, she uses superstructure and infrastructure, right? So there is that which is the kind of concealed nucleus of the system and that which makes itself apparent in the system, right? And then the question is, what does this superstructure conceal, right? It conceals a whole host of things, but most of all, it conceals the relations, right? And this was her main critique of Marxism, right? Was that it focused too much on the unit of analysis and less on the relation, which is actually something that Marx says. Marx says that capital is first and foremost a relation, not necessarily unit, right? It's points inside of the unit, the relations inside the unit. But anyway, so to focus on the relation, and that is the thing which capitalism, right, obscures. It obscures the relation that is at the kind of, that is the concealed nucleus of the system, which she then says is then made generalizable in different modalities later on in the text. So there's a way that there are those things which are apparent in the system and those things which are not apparent in the system. And the question is, what is being concealed, right? And what emerges right out of that space? And that space of, what she calls the negation. And I think that's where her analysis of Junkanoo becomes important, because that language is concealed by the system, which is why she has to document it explicitly in that way, offer a glossary. And we know that any attempt to use concepts, we know it's a lost cause, right? Like, you're simply by naming something in such a way, like you're fixing it in a place and time, something already exceeds it. But right, she is still telling us, right, that this is what's concealed by the system, right? And in that way, it's hard to ask the question of what her critique of Marxism is without asking again about what her kind of writings on the aesthetic mediations of people in the Americas are, without then also saying that what is at the concealed nucleus of that whole thing are the things like Junkanoo, right? Which are seen as the infrastructure and not the superstructure. But the superstructure serves to conceal that thing, which is so important, right? So it's like, that was really long and what have you, but like, that's kind of how I see the question of Junkanoo, if that was helpful. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question. Sorry. Hey everyone. First, thank you all for your words. They were really incredible, and like I really enjoyed listening to them. So my question was, right now I'm just thinking a lot about Winter's use of like religious language, like throughout across all of her texts, and the way that she occupies the space between the political and the religious. And so I guess my question is just like, how does that kind of evolve across Black Metamorphosis? Like, what were you kind of like seeing there, and like, what do you make of her? Like, is she speaking in metaphors, or is this very much like a very religious experience that she's talking about in a secular sense almost, or is that even a binary that she believes in? Yeah.
I think that what is important is that if you begin to look at Sylvia's work from what she's writing in London, you will begin to see, I think, an attention paid to religious forms and an attempt to interpret religious forms in cultural ways. And if you go to her only novel, Hills of Hebron, it is about a religious group that has withdrawn themselves from Jamaican society. And her favorite novelists at that moment in the early 1950s, late 1950s and early 60s, is actually Roger Mace's novel, and it is Brother Man. And Brother Man is the story of a Rastafarian. So that, yeah, and she talks a lot about Roger Mace and his centrality. And her Hills of Hebron, for example, is a novel which is not the normal Caribbean nationalist novel. I mean, everybody, there's a whole history about Caribbean nationalist novel, making the Caribbean nation, and you list the authors. You can't put Sylvia in that category. You can't put her in that category because she is actually writing not about the nation. She's writing against the nation that's being formed. She's writing against the nationalist nation being formed because she's paying very deep attention to the subaltern forces. What she calls, I'm using her word, her words are the symbolic underworld of Blacks. And so for Sylvia, the symbolic underworld of Blacks can be seen in religion, but not just in religion, but in Afro-derived religions. So it is, in the Caribbean case, it's about nihilism, about Kumina. Her critique of Jankono, or critique of the National Dance Theatre Company and Rex, is that what Rex was doing, and really very important work, was that in the post-colonial Jamaica, right after the independence, he was trying to stage the actual quote-unquote folk religion and put it on stage. Wynter was upset with that, because what Wynter thought was that kind of staging, in fact, devalued, and this is an argument that some people have, and some people disagree with her, devalued the quote-unquote folk. In other words, it couldn't get to, and she used the word folk then, following Robert Field. But it couldn't get to, in her view, a certain kind of authenticity, because she wanted to think about that. So her view was, and I think this is really something about her that's remarkable. Her view was that to choreograph dances based on quote unquote Kumina, nihilism, etc., put them on the stage was actually to do something to the dance themselves. So what is important is that she moved from, she moved out of dance to what? To write plays. Because for her, then the theater became the actual space in which performance could happen. But performance with some amount of authenticity could happen in terms of a set of stories that you have to tell. And then she begins her, if you look at her 8 plays, you will see a lot of them are about a history. So the Ballad of 1865, which is about a rebellion in Morant Bay, or the remarkable play done by her and Jim Nelson, Masquerade. you will see, which is about a certain kind of performance in which what she's trying to stage now on the stage, but she's trying to stage something that she knows is one step removed from the actual subaltern itself. But she's staging that life. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, theater then becomes her space, her work, the way in which I think she can begin to tell a set of stories that become that are important. And in all of that, Afro religions really deeply important to her as this site, I'll come back to, as these kind of counter-symbolic sites, symbolic, or what I call sometimes kind of counter-symbolic insurgencies that actually open up a different space for ordinary Black people. Let me end here. One of the most, Sylvia wrote numerous articles to our newspaper. And one of the sharpest articles she writes is an article attacking the middle class intelligentsia for not understanding Bedouinism. And Bedouinism was a Afro-Jamaican religious form in which the leader said, Bedouin, there's a white wall and there's a black wall. And I'm going to make the black wall overturn the white wall. And so on. And there's a whole set of stories about him in a place called Augustown, for those of you who know Jamaica. And Kerry Miller has just written a remarkable novel called Augustown, which you should all read. His name is Kerry Miller. Your generation. I mean, just a remarkable novel about that period, about him, about Bedford, right? She writes these long articles, a couple of them, into the Jamaican newspaper, critiquing the Black intelligentsia for not understanding that, for not understanding how central Afro-religious forms were to ordinary Black people. And she uses Bedouin as a linchpin. And our argument is that Bedouinism is actually a contemporary form of Garvism. And Garvey becomes very important in her writing as well. Really very important.
Maybe we only have a few minutes left. Maybe what we could do is, unless there are other questions, is invite everybody from the working group to make any kind of final comment they would like to make. I mean, there are so many things I would like to have time to ask. I wanted to ask Felicia to say more about citational mutiny. I wanted to ask Kristen about more about this idea of how Wynter handles the figural conventions of the West. I wanted to ask Bedour about the aesthetic mediations she finds in the manuscript, and also to ask Bryant about sort of the use of Romance languages in the text. So there's so much to talk about that we won't get to. But if anybody from the group has any final comments, that would be great. And then maybe we could ask Tony at the end to just give us the latest on where the is and what have you.
Actually, I'll jump in because I did want to weigh in on a couple of the other questions, but so I'll try to wrap it all into one final thought. I think what's really important about, or this question of religion, there's almost this feeling that, and this kind of strings the questions together, that Black assembly always has this potential for a transcendent eruption. And I feel her, like you get the Trinidadian Carnival as this militant space, but there are always these pockets of divine opening almost that I see her thinking a little bit about. So obviously religion and the founding heresies of the knowledge order plays a different role in the later work, but there's what stayed with me, like a quote. She said, as the non-property, their sense of manhood, and we can talk about how it's gendered in some ways, manhood goes beyond rank and status to bare, forked, unaccommodated man. I-manity, another Rasta term, replaces abstract humanity. The relation of togetherness will be concrete. Jah has gone to prepare a place that where he is, I, man, may abide. Here explicitly is the enchanted city of all millenarian movements, the dream world where the state shall wither away. Here takes on a verbal, musical flesh. So there's this, within the militancy, within these different spaces that she's carved out, the plot, the auction block, the hold, there's always a place of when black people assemble, there's like an imminent transcendence almost that feel the text working through. So I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about that. And just briefly, in terms of Marx, I think consciousness becomes a really interesting departure, because if the antagonism is not between the worker and the means of production, but the worker's relative placement in the global world system, then how you track consciousness and what constitutes false consciousness for her becomes a different story. And so I think the departure is at value, but it's really that terrain of consciousness, and maybe around this last thing about the divinity, the divine, maybe, and those are not good words, but there's something she's working through there, I feel like. And then, I skipped this quote, but I had chosen it as one of the meaningful ones. So the tradition of labor militancy in the United States began with the Blacks, and that the white, this means that the tradition of labor militancy in the United States began with the Blacks, and that the white proletariat, if it is to validate its existence as a proletariat rather than as white, must be able to see its own struggles in every slave revolt. It must assume its own history as distinct from the history of the bourgeoisie. And so I think she, like Dr. Bogues says, by the end, these thoughts are even kind of like recycled a little bit, but she's working through something about race trader being the authentic proletariat identity. And then she always talks about the psychic frontier that whiteness creates. And so there's all those dimensions about consciousness become really important. And I think I'll stop there. Citational mutiny, I think everyone has kind of made my point, and you can pick literature, song lyrics, historical scenes, the way she paints them out, the dense theoretical business, art. It's just how she holds them is remarkable.
I just briefly wanted to weigh in, also threading together Zuri and Ra's points, because I think one instance in Black Metamorphosis where both points kind of are inflected is her characterizing of the plot in the plantation, which she kind of elaborates later in other works. But here she talks very much about how the plot is this grounds that the plantation provisions that, also sows the potential seeds of its own demise, because there's this religious inflection, this register of like religious import, but also this kind of this register of like cosmological import. She's like, what the plot does is it transforms the products of production into just use value, and that is a like major counter hegemonic move on the plantation, whose whole like objective justification is to produce surplus. So in the very act of the plot provisioning, yams, for instance, as use value, something to be consumed for the body, like that sets the kind of cosmological stage for the enslaved, for blacks assembled on that plot to be in relation to the products of their labor, against the like imposed relations of domination of the plantation. And to me, that is a like deification, what she will later call a de-godding of like Marxist surplus value that is not to be like neglected. And so I think she wants to kind of like de-god the Marxist analysis of surplus value in the instance of reintroducing the plot as like the plantation requires the plot to kind of compensate for the kind of caloric, mathematical kind of bodily calculations that, Bedour talks about in her work, to compensate for those very like precise anti-human calculations. But in so doing, it also sows the potential seeds of its demise by virtue of inviting this new relation. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. And I think maybe that kind of also inflects this question of her her preoccupation with the figural domain, right? Like these concepts are not concepts that just exist abstractly, but she's really trying to like push the utility of thinking with surplus value and see like, wait a minute, actually, this Marxist conception of political economy is not fully accounting for this other scheme of valuation that transcends the terms that Marx can kind of like work within.
Great, great. Any final thoughts, Bryant?
Absolutely. Thank you for the reflections and the question. I guess, let's see, I would also conclude with sharing just more of her words. But to your question about languages, I think it often comes down to what we have been speaking about with regard to who she's citing. And I know Wynter is, early on in the manuscript, she's really thinking through Sepulveda, and she is intentional about who she's citing and using language to index what she identifies as a symbolic order, and giving us a means or a tactic to break that symbolic order and suggest what happens when that symbolic order is disfigured or ruptured, or when Black folks move out of that symbolic order, what happens. And so to share a quote, I think this quote also speaks to the question about culture that we've been discussing. But I guess to end, I think it's also concise in a way. The monograph sees the Black underlife culture as a form of sustained resistance to the dominant code, sees the rebellious movements from Miall to Marley, from Nat Turner to Garvey to MLK to Malcolm X, as attempts to put into play a counter-violence, symbolic or actual, to the institutionalized violence of the hegemonic system. And I think that sort of speaks to a couple loose ends that have been presented so far. But
thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so just to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, excuse me. So just to kind of wrap up, I think there are a few things that are really important to kind of sit with in this text. And one of the things Professor Bogues alluded to before, but this idea that the break that we're looking for is not in the kind of Fanonian leap, and it's also not in the return, it's certainly in the present, right? And so that's what, and also in thinking about the way that she kind of theorizes the third event, that you can see the way that she's setting us up for her understanding of the third event. And it wasn't until I did my interview with her that I understood precisely how Black Metamorphosis is connected to her ideas around the third event. Because in the interview, she said that we have to think about the third event as an initiation process, right? And what happens via the process of initiation is that we first have to change, right, the world of symbols and language around us in order for that initiation to occur. And she tells us, right, that the third event is the only one where language is going to take us there, right? Language is going to be the only thing that gets us to wherever. And we can see the way that that is kind of so primary in Black Metamorphosis, and the way that that commitment to language has been kind of maintained. And in terms of, the like aesthetic mediations, it's interesting, right? Because she makes all these kinds of really like adroit kind of theoretical moves around aesthetics, but the text itself has an aesthetic dimension that I think is so important, right? The way that it's written, the repetitions, like Bryant said, that to me is an aesthetic move, because like he said, it's disciplined. You're like disciplining us into trying to unburden us of all the things that we come with when we arrive at the text, and discipline us out of it, right? And kind of give us all the cues and reminders, right, that we need to let go and kind of leap into her world of language and symbols. And I think that, the very last kind of lines of the text are kind of, I think, important, because she says that it is these kinds of aesthetic mediations that were first kind of like born out of pain, right? But because they were born out of, pain and struggle, she ends by saying, the Akan proverb, quote, "When all the world bears the burden of the gods, no one goes humpbacked," right? So that the point is not to simply document these metamorphoses for evidence or for a way to show what Black people have done as new natives in this new world, but the purpose, right, is to kind of what she later calls build that ecumenical referent we, right? Where, that might be kind of the burden, and also the possibility of that break in the present might be shared with everybody, right? And I think that's what I kind of take home from the text more so than anything else.
Terrific. And last words, Tony?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, first, thanks to everybody for attending, and really thank the members of the group, the collective, editorial collective, for really tremendous presentations, and for the work that they've been doing over the last years. There are two things I would end with. One is that partly because we've just come through a moment of Black Lives Matter, is that the Rodney King riots in the early 90s. Sylvia wrote a text, No Human Involved, which was taken from the Los Angeles police handbook. When they arrested, when they arrested Black folks, saying no humans involved. And one of the things that she says in that letter to her colleagues is that she appeals to them as intellectuals to begin to write and think in the language she calls the language of the streets. And by this, I take her to mean that she's trying to, again, in the way she's done in Black Metamorphosis and the way she did in a lot of our other works, right before 1980, quite frankly, and then sometimes after that, when she begins to talk about the liminal, she's trying to find ways in which intellectuals must have a way to work with and to speak and to think alongside those folks who are in the streets, and what those folks are in the streets, what those folks in the streets are doing. So I want to point that out, because I think a lot of times when we think of Wynter, we think of her as an abstract thinker, philosopher who's not really preoccupied with certain things. But if you read her carefully, it is there are elements of her which always makes an appeal for us to think through very carefully what is the relationship to ordinary people. And particularly when they're in what she and James would call in motion. Where we are with the book, we have to finish the text. We have to transcribe it. We are doing all of that very carefully. We're not, in my conversations with Duke, I had a much shorter timeline, but this has proven to be a text with a labor of love and care, quite frankly. And also moving, involved, there are all sorts of things we didn't talk about, like which text to finally go with. In other words, when we were packing up her papers to, to go to the library that finally got them, we were finding different versions. I think it was Kristen who called me because she went first, but Prof, there are about 3 or 4 different versions here of Black Metamorphosis. So the question became which version, and then that is her text. So it also meant discussions with her about, quite frankly, about what to do and so on. And we have always been very attentive, quite frankly, to a certain ethic in which she's involved. About around the text, which means her calling me sometimes to say, I think you need to put this in it, or you need to write this, or you need to say this, or you need, when you're in the group, when you reach here, you need to come back to me about certain things and so on. So I really, quite frankly, don't want to say it will be published in 2 years. What I would say to you is that my hope is that in the near future, quite frankly, we will be able to deliver a manuscript to Duke University Press. And I know that once they get it, it will be priority for them.
Well, thank you for that. This was a really rich session, as I anticipated. And I want to just thank you for your time, for talking to us about your work as a collective. To all the participants who joined, this is really fantastic. And please update us with any information about the work of the collective, the status of the text. We're interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
You too.
So much.
Bye, thanks.
Bye, collective.
Bye bye. Bye bye.